No one left White City. Those who tried vanished. And somehow, Silas Kane had come back.
The room reeked of oil, sweat, and rust. The stale air hung thick, suffocating in the dim glow of the single bulb that swayed above. Its faint flicker carved sharp, dancing shadows across the cracked concrete walls, making them seem alive. Silas Kane sat slumped in the center of the room, his arms lashed tightly behind a rusted chair that wobbled with the slightest movement. His head drooped forward, strands of dark hair sticking to his damp forehead, the left side of his face swollen and angry beneath a purpling bruise. Dried blood crusted at the edge of his mouth, and his breath came shallow, each inhale dragging fire across his fractured ribs. His shirt clung to him, damp and stained with sweat and grime, the faint metallic tang of his own blood lingering at the back of his throat. Across the table, Lieutenant Garrett sat like a blade waiting to strike. His elbows rested on the surface, his eyes fixed on Silas with predatory calm. The harsh angles of his armored shoulders cast jagged shadows against the wall behind him. His knuckles rapped against the steel table, slow, methodical beats that punctuated the silence like gunfire in the dark. "You're wasting my time, Kane." Silas didn't respond. He kept his breathing even, though each pulse of pain in his ribs screamed for attention. The cracked rib beneath his skin throbbed relentlessly, the memory of Eric's last blow still fresh and seething. Garrett's eyes narrowed, the lines around his mouth hardening. "You were coming from White City's direction. Nobody survives out there by accident." Silas slowly lifted his head just enough to meet Garrett's stare with his good eye, the other swollen shut beneath a darkening bruise. His expression betrayed nothing, flat, cold, unreadable. In the corner, Eric shifted restlessly, leaning against the wall with his rifle slung lazily across his back. The younger guard's eyes flicked between Garrett and Silas, filled with the jittery energy of someone itching for action. "He's playing us. Let me loosen him up." Before Garrett could answer, the heavy door creaked open, and Orianthe stepped inside, her boots clicking softly against the concrete floor. She was tall, with lean muscle beneath fitted armor, and a quiet authority that made the room feel colder. Her hair, tied back in a tight braid, glinted silver at the edges despite her youth. "Still at it, Eric?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged like tempered steel. "I told you to hold off until I got here." Eric's grin faded slightly. "We were just warming him up." Orianthe crossed the room in measured steps, standing between Garrett and Silas. Her sharp eyes scanned Silas, lingering on the bruises blooming across his ribs and the blood trickling down his chin. "He's not going anywhere," she said, coolly. "No point breaking him to pieces if we still need answers." Garrett gave a small nod but didn't look pleased. "You know how this works, Ori. Men like him don't crack with words alone." She met his gaze without blinking. "They do if you know how to ask the right questions." Silas exhaled, watching the subtle power shift. He recognized the kind of control she wielded, not with brute force like Eric, but with precision, keeping the worst instincts of men like Garrett in check. Eric rolled his shoulders, stepping back. "Fine, but you're holding us up. Good. He's worth more alive than dead," she replied flatly. Her eyes narrowed as she turned back to Garrett. "Or do you want to explain to the boss why Kane's a corpse before we know if he's a spy?" Garrett's mouth twisted into a scowl, but he relented with a sigh. "We'll do it your way. For now." Eric lingered by the wall, flexing his fingers. "We could use the serum," he suggested, his voice light but edged with something darker. "No man keeps secrets after a dose of that." Garrett shook his head. "Not yet. Too easy. A man like Kane needs to stew. Truth serum works, but fear lasts longer." Or, Eric added, glancing at Orianthe, "we let the boys in the barracks have a turn." Her stare hardened. "That's not happening." Garrett raised a hand. "I said not yet. He's no use to us if he's broken beyond repair. Give him 3 days. No food, no water." Orianthe gave Silas a final glance, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw something beneath the steel mask, a flicker of empathy quickly buried. 3 days without food is a long time, Orianthe said, her tone quieter now. A man can lose his mind before he loses his tongue. I've seen it happen. Garrett leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. You worried about him, or about what he might know? Orianthi's expression didn't waver. I'm worried about wasting resources. We can't afford to ruin what might be valuable. Eric laughed under his breath. Soft spot, huh? You're wasting breath, Ori. Her gaze flicked to Eric, freezing him in place. I'm wasting nothing, but you might be wasting Kane's life with your heavy hands. If he dies, I'll make sure the boss knows why. Silas closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of tension that filled the room. Even in pain, he could tell, Orianthi's word carried weight, more than Eric's bravado or Garrett's need for control. She wasn't just a guard. She was the one keeping them all from slipping too far. The door groaned as Eric retrieved his rifle, casting one last glance over his shoulder. The heavy slab slammed shut, leaving Silas alone in the stillness, listening to the hum of the flickering light and the faint rasp of his shallow breaths. Rumors whispered of White City drifted through the interrogation like a phantom. It was said that no one left the city once they entered, and those who approached its towering walls disappeared without a trace. Garrett's paranoia wasn't without reason. White City wasn't just a place. It was a threat. Orianthi watched the door close behind Eric, the clang of metal echoing in the silence. Her eyes shifted back to Silas, assessing him with an intensity that pierced through his stoic facade. She took a step closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. Silas met her gaze, unflinching despite the pain gnawing at his body. She stopped just within arm's reach, close enough for him to see the fine lines of experience etched into her face, barely visible beneath the harsh light. Silas, she murmured, her voice low enough that only he could hear. I can keep them off you for a while. He didn't react, but she saw the flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. But you still have to answer the question sooner or later, she continued, her tone carrying a mix of warning and something almost like understanding. Silas's lips tightened, a silent refusal. He'd been through worse and had no intention of breaking now. But Orianthi's proximity brought an unexpected sensation, a strange, electric chemistry that neither fully understood but both could feel. Her breath was warm against his skin as she leaned closer. You're tougher than they think, she whispered. But toughness only goes so far. Silas held her gaze, sensing layers behind her words, experience, perhaps loss. He wondered how much she had seen and what had hardened her resolve yet kept a core of empathy intact. For a moment, their eyes locked in silent communication, a tenuous thread connecting them amidst the bleakness. It was a chemistry forged not by attraction but by mutual recognition, warriors who understood the unspoken rules of survival. Orianthi straightened, stepping back but not breaking eye contact. The flicker of empathy returned, more visible now but still controlled. She wasn't offering salvation, she was offering time, a precious commodity in their brutal world. I'll buy you what time I can, she said quietly. Use it wisely. Silas gave a small nod, acknowledging her effort without words. The room seemed to grow colder as Orianthi turned away, the brief moment of connection dissolving into the reality of their situation. As she walked toward the door, Silas couldn't help but feel a spark of something unfamiliar, a glimmer of hope or perhaps just a sliver of respect for the woman who balanced on the knife edge between duty and compassion. Orianthi's boots clattered on the concrete floor as she exited the cell. Marcus, the chief of security, followed closely, his weathered face contorted in anger. He seized her arm, pulling her to face him in the dimly lit corridor. What the hell was that? His fingers dug into her armor. Getting chummy with the prisoner, Orianthi's silver-threaded braid glinted in the light as she jerked her arm free. Her eyes narrowed, mirroring his intensity. Take your hand off me. The steel in her voice made him step back. You want answers? You won't get them by breaking him. Marcus's face turned red. So you do have a soft spot for him. Is that it? I have a soft spot for results. She squared her shoulders, her height advantage making him look up. You've been at this how long? 20 years? And how many prisoners have you lost to overzealous questioning? He crossed his arms, jaw tight. You're playing with fire, Ori. Do you even know what you're doing? A cold smile spread across her face. More than you think. I've broken tougher men than him, without leaving a mark. She leaned in, her voice lowering. The difference is, mine lived to talk. The room was cold, but sweat trickled down Silas Kane's temple as he leaned back in the rusted metal chair, his wrists bound tightly behind him. The flickering light overhead buzzed faintly, a dull reminder that silence rarely lasted long in Fraction X's interrogation rooms. Beyond the cracked window, the shadow of the White City loomed over the horizon, visible even through the grime-streaked glass. Lieutenant Garrett paced the room, his boots echoing sharply against the concrete floor. "I don't like when people lie to me, Kane," he said, pausing to stare at Silas. "You came from the White City's direction. Nobody just walks by that place without reason." Silas's eyes drifted toward the window. Even shackled, his gaze carried weight. The White City was always there, bleeding pale light across the wasteland as if mocking those left to rot outside its walls. His chest tightened at the sight, memories clawing their way forward, unbidden and unwelcome. "You think I got inside?" Silas's voice was hoarse, but there was steel behind it. "No one gets in. You know that." Garrett's lips curled into a thin smile. "Funny thing is, I think you did. And I think you know something about those walls the rest of us don't." Silas said nothing. He let the silence sit between them, cold and heavy. But Garrett wasn't the kind of man to enjoy silence for long. Garrett straightened, stepping back from the table. He studied Silas with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, as if trying to decipher a puzzle he already knew was missing pieces. "I think you're lying," Garrett said. "But that's fine. We have time." Silas shifted his gaze to the window once more. The White City stared back, distant yet suffocating. Whatever Garrett thought he knew didn't matter. The city had taken enough from Silas already. As Garrett exited the room, the door clanging shut behind him, Silas let his head drop back against the chair. The cold from the metal seeped into his skin, but it wasn't enough to keep the memories at bay. Outside, the White City's pale glow stretched across the horizon, indifferent to the men who fought and died beneath its gaze.
Silas woke the way he always woke now, already holding his breath. The room was the same: concrete, oil, rust. A single bulb swinging like a slow pendulum. The ropes biting into his wrists. The metal chair cold under him. But for a moment, just a moment, he wasn't here. He was back at the wall. Not the stories people told about White City. Not the whispered myths that made men brave at campfires. The real thing. The light. It wasn't bright like fire. It wasn't clean like sun. It was flat, a pale, steady glow that didn't come from anywhere and didn't behave like light should. It didn't cast shadows properly. It didn't warm anything. It just watched. Silas remembered the way the wasteland changed as you got close. The wind stopped carrying sand. Sound fell away. Even his footsteps had sounded wrong, too loud, too close, like the ground was listening for them. And the wall. People called it a wall because their minds needed a word. But it wasn't stone. It wasn't metal. It wasn't glass. It looked like all three at once, layered in a way that made his eyes refuse to focus. Like the surface couldn't decide what it was in the same instant it was being looked at. He'd pressed a hand to it. It hadn't felt cold. It hadn't felt warm. It had felt like nothing. As if the wall didn't recognize the concept of touch. And then, this part always came back sharper than everything else. A sound. Not a voice. A tone, low and steady, like a distant machine humming through bone. It had vibrated the air around him. Not loud, precise. Measured. Like it was taking a reading. He turned. And seen a silhouette on the other side of the glow. Not a person. Not a guard. A shape that stood still and somehow still felt like motion. Silas had blinked, and the shape had been closer. No footsteps. No movement. Just closer. His heart had tried to climb out of his throat. He'd stumbled backward, hand reaching for his weapon, body reacting before thought could catch up. And the tone had shifted. Higher, Slightly. Like adjustment. Like recalibration. Silas remembered thinking, very calmly, very clearly. It knows I'm here. Then his memory broke into pieces. A blur of pale light. A pressure behind his eyes. A moment where time felt thin, stretched, incorrect. And the last thing he remembered before waking in the wasteland days later was the wall doing something a wall should never do. It had opened. Not with a seam. Not with a door. The surface had simply yielded, as if reality had been asked to step aside. Silas breathed out slowly in the interrogation room, chest tight, ribs screaming. He forced his eyes open. The bulb swung. The ropes held. The concrete stank. But the light, pale and flat, still lived behind his eyes. And no matter what Garrett thought he knew, Silas knew one thing for sure. White City hadn't let him go. White City had let him leave.
The dim light flickered again, casting long shadows over the room as Silas shifted against the ropes binding his wrists. His muscles ached from hours of confinement, but his mind stayed sharp, counting every second Garrett was gone. He tested the ropes quietly, feeling for weaknesses. The knot wasn't perfect. Eric, the younger guard, had tied it in a rush after the last interrogation session. Silas twisted his wrists, feeling the coarse fibers loosen slightly. His eyes flicked to the cracked window. Beyond it, the White City loomed like a ghost, but it wasn't the city he feared now. It was Garrett. And he knew Garrett would return soon, angrier and less patient. Footsteps echoed faintly from the hall. Silas froze, breath held. The guard outside the door shifted but didn't enter. Eric. Too green for this line of work. Silas worked quickly. With one last tug, the rope slipped free, and he pulled his arms forward, rubbing feeling back into his wrists. He stood, muscles groaning in protest. The lock on the door rattled. Silas pressed himself against the wall beside the frame, heart pounding but his expression calm. The door creaked open. Eric stepped inside, rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. Silas struck fast, one hand closing around the barrel of Eric's rifle, the other smashing into his throat. Eric choked, eyes wide with panic as he crumpled to the floor. Silas knelt, easing the rifle from Eric's hands. He didn't need to kill the kid, just get out. He slipped into the hallway, rifle in hand, keeping low as he followed the sound of distant voices. The compound was quiet, most of Fraction X settling down for the night. Silas passed through the armory, spotting a jeep near the outer gate, crates of ammunition strapped to its sides. Perfect. Garrett's voice carried from deeper within the compound. Silas didn't wait to hear more. He climbed into the jeep, fired the engine, and tore through the perimeter fence as alarms blared behind him. Silas drove for hours under the fading sun, the jeep rattling over cracked earth and scattered debris. The vehicle groaned with each bump, but Silas pressed on, eyes fixed on the horizon. His thoughts stayed focused on the mission: escape, survive, find answers. The stronghold shrank in the rearview mirror, replaced by the vast emptiness of the wasteland. Wind whipped dust into swirling clouds, and silence fell heavy, broken only by the jeep's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath its tires. He glanced at the gas gauge. Running low. He had to make it count. As dusk approached, he spotted movement ahead, dark shapes flickering against the pale sky. Silas slowed, peering through the grime-streaked windshield. It wasn't until he got closer that he saw it. Rustbrook. The village looked like a patchwork quilt stitched from rusted metal and weathered wood. Makeshift defenses, barbed wire fences and rickety watchtowers, encircled it like a protective cocoon. Smoke rose lazily from a few chimneys, mingling with the evening air. Silas knew Rustbrook's reputation for turning away strangers. Rolling into the village in a stolen jeep loaded with ammunition would get him shot on sight. He needed a different approach. He veered off the road, steering the jeep into a dense thicket a few miles from the settlement. The vehicle bumped and jolted as it left the beaten path, its tires crunching over dry brush and snapping twigs. Silas parked in the shade of a massive, gnarled tree. He killed the engine and climbed out, muscles aching from the long drive. The smell of gasoline mingled with the earthy scent of dried leaves and sunbaked soil. He grabbed an armful of brush and began covering the Jeep, working quickly but meticulously. Dry branches scratched at his arms, but he ignored them, focused on concealing his presence. He made sure to hide the crates of ammunition particularly well. If anyone stumbled upon the Jeep, he lingered for a moment, tightening the strap of his rifle. With a glance toward Rustbrook's gates shimmering in the distance, Silas began the walk into town, footsteps crunching softly over the barren soil. The landscape stretched out before him, a wasteland of dry grass and scattered debris. Every step felt like a test of his endurance, each one a reminder of his need to stay alert. The rifle's weight on his back was a constant companion, both reassuring and burdening. As he neared the outskirts, he slowed his pace. Makeshift defenses became clearer. Rusted barbed wire strung between metal poles, scrap metal barriers cobbled together with skill born of necessity. Silas noted the watchtowers, 3 in total, each manned by a vigilant guard scanning the horizon. They didn't miss much in this place. Silas approached with measured caution, hands visible and empty to avoid any misunderstandings. He felt eyes on him long before he reached shouting distance of the gate. "Halt!" a voice called from above. "State your business." Silas stopped and raised his hand slightly. "Looking for refuge," he called back, voice steady despite the tension knotting in his gut. A pause followed, filled with the low hum of wind through metal and distant murmurs from within the village. Finally, another voice chimed in, a woman this time. "Name?" "Silas Kane." The guards exchanged glances before one disappeared from view. Silas could hear muffled conversation but couldn't make out any words. The waiting felt like another interrogation room, only without the walls pressing in. Minutes passed before the gate creaked open just enough to allow one person through. A figure stepped out, tall, lean, wearing a patchwork uniform that had seen better days. "You come unarmed?" the woman asked, her eyes sharp beneath a cap that shadowed her face. Silas nodded and unstrapped his rifle, setting it down slowly on the ground in front of him. "No trouble," he said simply. She glanced at it but didn't pick it up. "We'll see about that," she replied before motioning for him to follow her inside. As Silas walked through the gate, he took in Rustbrook's interior, narrow dirt paths winding between huts and shacks constructed from scavenged materials. People moved about their tasks with wary glances toward him. Strangers were always a gamble here. "Wait here," she ordered when they reached a small clearing near what looked like a central meeting area. Silas obeyed, standing still as villagers cast curious but guarded looks his way. His senses stayed sharp, cataloging exits and potential threats even as he waited for whatever judgment Rustbrook would pass on him next. Silas remained still, eyes scanning his surroundings. Villagers continued their work, some casting furtive glances his way. He could feel their curiosity and unease. An outsider represented uncertainty, possibly danger. Minutes ticked by. The sun bore down, its relentless heat amplifying the fatigue that had settled deep in his bones. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, resisting the urge to sit or lean against anything that might signal weakness. The door opened again, and a man emerged, broad-shouldered with graying hair and a face lined by years of hard decisions. His gaze met Silas's with an intensity that spoke of authority and experience. "Name's Tomas," he introduced himself, voice gruff but measured. "I run things around here." Silas nodded in acknowledgement. "Silas Kane." Tomas looked him over, assessing more than just the surface details. "Heard you're seeking refuge," he said finally. "That's right. And what brings you to our gates?" Silas considered his response carefully. "Needed a place to lay low," he answered truthfully enough without giving away more than necessary. Tomas studied him for another moment before nodding slightly. "We'll see about that," he said, echoing the woman's earlier words. He turned back toward the building and motioned for Silas to follow him inside. The woman fell into step beside them as they entered the dim interior of Rustbrook's central hub. A figure emerged from the shadows near the blacksmith's outpost, moving with a familiarity that set Silas on edge. The man wore a long, weather-beaten coat that brushed against his patchwork armor, the metal pieces clinking softly with each step. As he stepped into the light, his scruffy beard and sharp features became more visible, revealing a face that had seen its share of hardship. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the surroundings with a predator's gaze, assessing every detail with ruthless efficiency. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew the territory well, a fact that made Silas's muscles tense as he prepared for whatever might come next. Silas remained stoic, his eyes darting around the village, taking in every detail of Rustbrook's layout and defenses. The villagers eyed him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, their movements cautious but determined. Silas's eyes narrowed as the man in the coat approached. The sharp green eyes and lean, weathered face triggered a flood of memories. Trapper Reed, an old companion from his army days, stood before him. The years hadn't dulled Trapper's edge, if anything, they'd honed it to a razor's sharpness. "Didn't expect to see you here," Trapper spoke, his voice gruff but tinged with curiosity. "You look like you've been through hell." Silas offered a slight nod, keeping his expression neutral. "Could say the same for you, Reed." Trapper let out a dry chuckle, glancing around the village. "Rustbrook's a far cry from our old stomping grounds. But it's home now." Silas scanned the settlement, noting the makeshift defenses and wary villagers. "Seems like you've managed to keep it standing." Trapper's eyes hardened slightly. "We've had our share of trouble. Raiders mostly, but we've held our own." He studied Silas for a moment before adding, "Why are you really here, Kane?" Silas hesitated. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. "Just looking for a place to lay low." Trapper's gaze didn't waver. "This place doesn't take kindly to strangers who bring trouble." "Not planning on causing any," Silas replied evenly. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken history and the weight of past battles. Finally, Trapper nodded. "All right then," he said, his tone grudgingly accepting. "Tomas will have final say on whether you stay or go. But if you're here to stir up anything—" "I'm not," Silas interrupted, meeting Trapper's gaze head-on. Another beat of silence passed before Trapper turned and motioned for Silas to follow him inside the main building where Tomas waited. As they walked side by side, Silas couldn't help but recall the countless missions they'd survived together, each one cementing a bond forged in fire and blood. But he kept those memories buried deep. This was not the time for sentimentality. Inside the main building, Tomas looked up from his maps as they entered. His gaze shifted from Trapper to Silas with an appraising look. "Tomas," Trapper began without preamble, "this is Silas Kane. We served together back in the day." Tomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for further explanation. "He needs a place to stay," Trapper continued. "I vouch for him." Tomas's expression remained guarded as he addressed Silas directly. "You'll have to earn your keep here like everyone else." "Understood," Silas replied simply. The village leader nodded once before turning back to his maps, signaling the end of their audience. As Silas followed Trapper out of the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had thrown them together again for a reason. Though what that reason might be remained as murky as ever in this harsh new world they inhabited. The two men moved through the village, Trapper leading the way with a purposeful stride. Silas kept pace, his senses on high alert as they navigated the narrow pathways lined with makeshift homes and watchful eyes. Rustbrook was a patchwork of survival, a testament to the resilience of its people. Wooden barricades, reinforced with scavenged metal, stood as a first line of defense against the dangers of the wasteland. As they approached a larger structure at the center of the village, Silas noted the heightened security, guards armed with an array of weapons, their expressions hard and unyielding. Trapper exchanged brief nods with them before pushing open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air was cooler, dimly lit by flickering lanterns. The room was sparsely furnished but functional, maps and charts spread across a large table dominated the space. 3 figures sat behind it, their expressions a mix of authority and wariness. Elders, Trapper began, his tone respectful yet firm. This is Silas Kane. He's got something you'll want to hear. The elders turned their gaze to Silas, their eyes sharp and assessing. An older woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun spoke first. Welcome to Rustbrook, Mr. Kane, she said, her voice calm but commanding. We've heard about your escape. We need to know why you've come here. Silas met her gaze head-on, unflinching. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said plainly. I need refuge and I have information that might be valuable to you. Another elder leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. Information about what? The elder next to her, a man with a deeply lined face and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward slightly. Information about what? He asked, his tone skeptical yet intrigued. Silas took a breath, choosing his words carefully. The White City, he said simply. I've been there. I know its defenses. A murmur ran through the room as the elders exchanged glances. The mention of the White City held weight, a name that carried both hope and dread in equal measure. Go on, the silver-haired elder urged, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Silas. The third elder, a stout man with a thick beard and wary eyes, finally spoke up. Why should we trust you? He asked bluntly. For all we know, you could be leading trouble right to our doorstep. Trapper shifted beside Silas, his expression unreadable. Silas glanced at him briefly before turning back to the elders. I understand your caution, Silas said calmly. But I have no reason to harm this village. I just need a place to lay low for a while. He paused, letting his words sink in. Silence settled over the room as the elders deliberated silently amongst themselves. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. Silas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Fraction X is growing bolder. I barely escaped with my life. If they come this way, Rustbrook needs to be ready. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like dust in the air. The elders exchanged wary glances, the gravity of the situation evident on their faces. The silver-haired elder's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Silas. Fraction X? We've heard rumors, but nothing concrete. What makes you so certain they'll come here? Silas held her gaze, unflinching. They're expanding their territory, pushing further every day. They want control, resources, anything they can get their hands on. He paused, letting the urgency seep into his tone. Rustbrook's isolation won't protect you forever. The bearded elder leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. You expect us to take your word for it? Silas nodded. I've seen their camps, their numbers. They're not just scavengers anymore. They're organized and armed to the teeth. Trapper Reed shifted beside him, arms crossed as he listened intently. He's right, Trapper finally said, his voice carrying a note of reluctant agreement. I've seen signs of increased activity near the outskirts. The silver-haired elder glanced at Trapper before turning her attention back to Silas. What do you propose? Fortify your defenses, Silas replied without hesitation. Train your people for combat if you haven't already. Set up patrols and watch for any unusual activity. The blue-eyed elder spoke up, skepticism lacing his tone. And what's in it for you? Silas met his gaze evenly. I need a place to lay low and regroup, he said simply. If Rustbrook falls, I'm back out in the wasteland with no allies and nowhere to go. The elders fell into a hushed conversation amongst themselves, weighing Silas's words carefully. The atmosphere in the room was tense, each moment stretching longer than the last. Finally, the silver-haired elder turned to Trapper. Ensure our defenses are reinforced immediately, she instructed. Trapper nodded and looked at Silas with a newfound respect in his eyes. You'll have a place here, she continued, her voice resolute but cautious. But we'll be watching you closely. Silas inclined his head in acknowledgement, understanding the unspoken trust he would need to earn. One of the elders, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. And why would they come here? Because I escaped with more than just my life. I took their supplies and their pride. They'll want it back. The sharp-eyed elder's expression hardened, her gaze piercing through Silas. You've brought trouble to our doorstep. Silas met her eyes steadily. Trouble was coming whether I led it here or not. But now you have a chance to prepare. The room buzzed with murmurs of concern and distrust. The silver-haired elder raised a hand to silence them, focusing on Silas. "What exactly did you take?" "Food, weapons, ammunition," Silas listed off. "Enough to slow them down, but not stop them. And their pride?" The bearded elder's voice was a low rumble. Silas's jaw tightened as he remembered the chaos of his escape. Silas took a breath, feeling the weight of their stares. "I took one of their armored vehicles. It's hidden outside Rustbrook, in a thicket." The elders exchanged glances, murmurs rippling through the room. Trapper Reed's eyes widened, and he leaned in closer. "An armored vehicle? Why didn't you bring it in?" Silas shifted slightly, mindful of the tension in the room. "Bringing it inside would have drawn attention. They're already looking for me, and an armored vehicle would be a beacon. I couldn't risk leading them straight here." The silver-haired elder nodded slowly, considering his words. "And this vehicle, it's functional, fully operational," Silas confirmed. "Loaded with supplies and ammunition. It's a valuable asset, but also a target." The blue-eyed elder shook his head slowly. "You've made them desperate. Desperate and angry," Silas agreed. "But also reckless." The silver-haired elder stood, her movements deliberate and calm despite the rising anxiety in the room. She looked around at her fellow elders before addressing Silas once more. "We'll fortify as you suggested and prepare for the worst." She turned to Trapper Reed. "Double the patrols and ensure every able-bodied villager is armed and ready." Trapper nodded, his face set in grim determination. The elders sat in thoughtful silence, the weight of Silas's words settling over the dimly lit hall. Trapper shifted his stance slightly, arms crossed as he watched the deliberation unfold. The air felt heavy, the crackle of the hearth the only sound in the room. Finally, Elder Miriam, the oldest among them, spoke. "If Fraction X truly believes you are their enemy, they won't let this go. But bringing conflict to Rustbrook isn't something we take lightly." Her voice carried a gravitas that commanded attention. The other elders nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Miriam's eyes moved to Silas, scrutinizing him with an intensity that seemed to weigh his very soul. "What assurance do we have that aiding you won't bring greater harm to us?" she continued, her tone even but firm. Silas stood his ground, meeting her gaze without flinching. "There are no assurances in a world like ours," he replied. "But I know their tactics. I can help you prepare." The blue-eyed elder leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And what if they come for you? Will you stay and fight with us or leave us to fend for ourselves?" "I stay," Silas said firmly. "I owe you that much for your hospitality." The room fell silent again as they considered his words. The bearded elder broke the quiet with a deep sigh. "We've survived this long by staying out of larger conflicts. This could change everything." Elder Miriam nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Silas's face. "And yet, we cannot ignore the threat at our doorstep." She turned to Trapper. "You trust him?" Trapper uncrossed his arms and stepped forward. "I've known Silas a long time. He's a man of his word." Miriam considered this before speaking again. "Very well. We will prepare as if war is upon us." She addressed the room, her voice carrying authority and resolve. "Let every villager know what we face and what's at stake." The elders murmured their agreement before standing to leave. Elder Miriam looked back at Silas one last time. "You have our trust for now, but remember our deal." Silas nodded solemnly as he watched them file out of the hall, the crackling hearth casting long shadows on the walls. Trapper clapped a hand on Silas's shoulder once they were alone. "Let's get started." With that, the elders dismissed him, and Trapper led him out of the hall. As they walked through Rustbrook, the villagers watched them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Trapper stopped outside a small cabin at the village's edge. "This will be your place for now," he said. Silas glanced around before stepping inside, appreciating the modest shelter from the harshness of the wasteland. "You've stirred things up," Trapper commented as he leaned against the doorframe. "It was necessary," Silas replied simply. Trapper nodded slowly before turning to leave. "Rest while you can. Tomorrow we start preparations." Silas watched him go before settling onto a rough-hewn cot in the corner of the cabin, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. For now, Rustbrook offered a momentary respite from the chaos that hunted him, but he knew it wouldn't last forever.
Rustbrook didn't sleep like cities used to. It waited. Silas sat alone on the cot in the cabin they'd given him, listening to the village breathe through thin walls, boots on dirt, low voices, a hammer striking metal somewhere in the dark. He could feel their eyes on him even when he couldn't see them. Out in the lane, 2 villagers stood near a barrel fire, silhouettes flickering in orange light. He heard them before he saw them. "That's him," one voice said quietly. "The drifter. The one from the elders' hall. The one Trapper vouched for." A pause. The fire crackled. "You saw his face." "Yeah. Like he's already dead and doesn't care." Another pause. "They say he came from White City." Silas didn't move. He kept his posture loose. Hands open. Breathing steady. But every word landed. The second voice snorted. "No one comes from White City. Not alive." He did. Or he's lying. Silas watched the thin curtain shift with wind. The first voice lowered. "I heard Miriam gave him a place." "She shouldn't have." A third person joined them, heavier steps, a deeper voice. "Burke." Silas recognized him even without seeing his face. That kind of suspicion had weight. "You're all thinking the same thing," Burke said. "Say it." Silence. Then the first villager spoke again. "If Fraction X comes here." Burke didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was colder. "They will come here. Because men like that don't run alone. They run with consequences tied to their boots." Silas heard a cup clink against metal. Someone swallowed hard. He looked rough, the second villager offered, as if that softened the fear. "Bruised. Like they nearly killed him." Burke's response was immediate. "They should have finished it." The word sat there, ugly and honest. Silas closed his eyes for a second. Not because it hurt. Because Burke wasn't wrong. A long pause passed before Burke continued. "We've survived by being small," Burke said. "By being quiet. By staying off maps. Off minds." He stepped closer to the fire. The heat hissed. "Now we've put a story in our gate," he went on. "White City. Fraction X stolen supplies. A man who can't tell us what he really is." A softer voice, maybe the first villager, asked, "So what do we do?" Burke exhaled through his nose. "We prepare." "For war," someone whispered. Burke didn't deny it. "For burning. Because if they come, they won't just take food. They'll take people." Silas sat perfectly still. He wanted to stand up and walk out there and say, "I didn't choose this." Or maybe, "I'm the reason you're alive." But neither sentence was truth enough to matter. He listened as the voices drifted away, boots crunching in the dirt, the barrel fire popping. And for the first time since Rustbrook let him through its gate, Silas felt the village's trust like a thin plank over a deep drop. It held. For now. But one hard step, and it would snap.
The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the cabin, casting a soft glow on Silas's worn face. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the night before. The respite had been brief but necessary. He knew today would bring new challenges. Silas made his way to the central meeting hall, where he found Elder Miriam already engaged in conversation with a few villagers. Her silver hair caught the sunlight, giving her an almost ethereal presence. She noticed him approaching and excused herself from the group. "Silas," she greeted, her voice steady and composed. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," Silas replied, cutting straight to the point. "We need to retrieve the jeep and the supplies before someone else finds them." Miriam's brow furrowed slightly. "Is it truly that urgent? We've only just begun preparations here." "It is," Silas insisted, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The Jeep is loaded with ammunition and other supplies that could make a significant difference in our defenses. If it falls into the wrong hands. Miriam nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Where did you leave it? In a thicket near Rustbrook's outskirts, Silas explained. Hidden under brush, but it won't stay hidden forever. She turned to one of the villagers nearby, a burly man with a stern expression. Gather a small team. We'll retrieve the Jeep and its contents. The man nodded and hurried off to assemble a group. Miriam turned back to Silas, her eyes sharp with determination. I'll need 4 men. Trapper for recon, 2 guards to cover our flanks, and 1 on overwatch. Miriam glanced at Trapper. You willing? Trapper chuckled, a rough sound that echoed in the quiet hall. I'd like to see how much trouble Silas has gotten himself into this time. Count me in. Miriam turned to the other elders, her gaze sharp and decisive. A brief, silent agreement passed between them. She then addressed Silas again, her tone firm. Take Reed and 3 from the watchtower rotation. Keep it quiet. Silas nodded, appreciating her swift decision-making. He looked over at Trapper, who gave a quick nod, already mentally preparing for the task ahead. We leave now, Silas stated, his voice brooking no argument. Trapper and Silas exited the hall, their boots crunching softly on the dirt path as they headed toward the watchtower. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and impending rain. At the base of the tower, 3 guards stood at attention. Trapper grinned at them all. All right then, let's see if we can keep Silas out of trouble for once. They set off through the village gates with practiced ease, each member falling into their role seamlessly. The landscape around Rustbrook quickly shifted from cultivated plots to wild scrubland as they made their way toward the hidden Jeep. Doyle takes overwatch, Silas said, nodding toward the hill crest just outside the perimeter. Briggs, you're on my left flank, Lex on the right. Trapper, you scout ahead, keep your eyes peeled for patrols. We stick to comms and stay spread out. Lex gave a sharp nod, adjusting her knife belt. Understood. Without wasting a moment, Doyle moved toward the hill crest. His heavy repeater slung over his shoulder, he climbed with practiced ease until he found a vantage point that allowed him to oversee their position and the surrounding area. From there, he settled in, eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Briggs took his position on Silas's left flank, his movements quick and efficient. He kept his rifle at the ready, eyes darting from side to side as he moved. The tension in his posture betrayed his readiness for any sudden threat. Lex slid into position on Silas's right flank. Silas smirked but stayed silent, his eyes flicking between his team. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of walkie-talkies, scavenged from the village stockpile. He distributed them, each member taking one with a nod of understanding. Stay quiet unless you have eyes on something, Silas instructed, his voice a whisper carried by the wind. Briggs secured his walkie-talkie to his belt and checked his rifle's magazine. Copy that. Lex tested her walkie-talkie's volume, ensuring it was low enough not to give away their position. She then settled into her stance, knife at the ready. Trapper gave Silas a nod before moving ahead, his steps almost silent on the rough terrain. His eyes scanned the scrubland, searching for any signs of movement or danger. Silas took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This mission had to go smoothly. Rustbrook depended on it. He glanced back at Briggs and Lex, making sure they were ready before moving forward. The team moved in unison, each step calculated and careful. The silence between them was heavy but necessary, they all knew what was at stake. Doyle's figure was barely visible on the hill crest, but Silas could see the glint of his repeater in the dim light. Trapper signaled from up ahead, indicating that the path was clear. Silas motioned for Briggs and Lex to follow as he moved toward Trapper's position. As they approached the hidden Jeep, Silas felt a sense of relief wash over him. The vehicle remained untouched and well concealed under the thick brush. All right, he murmured to Trapper as they reached the Jeep. Let's get this done quickly. Briggs and Lex took their positions on either side of the Jeep, keeping watch while Trapper and Silas began to clear away the brush. The air was tense with anticipation, each rustle of leaves or snap of twigs setting their nerves on edge. Silas worked efficiently alongside Trapper, both men understanding the urgency of their task. As they worked in unison to prepare for their return journey, Silas couldn't help but feel a brief flicker of hope. The mission was progressing smoothly so far, if they could just keep it that way until they were safely back within Rustbrook's walls. The engine sputtered, then roared softly to life beneath his hand. "Good to go," Silas whispered into the walkie. Briggs glanced over his shoulder, giving a curt nod before returning his gaze to their surroundings. Lex shifted slightly, muscles tensing as she remained poised to react at a moment's notice. Trapper moved closer, still scanning the horizon. As they finished securing everything and prepared for their return journey, Silas couldn't shake a growing sense of urgency. He knew time was against them. Every second spent out here increased their risk of being discovered by Fraction X patrols or worse. The engine's low rumble filled Silas's ears as they began their journey back towards Rustbrook, ever watchful for any signs of trouble along their path. Doyle's voice crackled over the comms. "Silas, you've got movement. Small patrol coming in from the west. 4 men, Fraction X markings." Silas's jaw tightened. The timing couldn't be worse. "Hold position," he ordered. "Let them pass." Trapper's voice followed, laced with tension. "They're cutting too close. We might need to hit first." Silas exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing as the faint shapes of the patrol crept into view along the ridgeline. The jeep could mean salvation or disaster, depending on what happened next. "Doyle, keep them in your sights," Silas said softly. "Nobody fires unless I give the word." The Wasteland held its breath as the patrol drew closer. Briggs shifted slightly, his finger resting near the trigger of his rifle. Lex's eyes flickered towards Silas, waiting for any sign to act. Trapper remained still, his sharp gaze fixed on the approaching figures. The patrol moved cautiously, scanning the terrain as they walked. They were close enough now that Silas could make out their gear, standard issue for Fraction X scouts. Mismatched armor and weapons likely scavenged from past raids. One of the patrol members paused, turning his head slightly as if he sensed something was off. Silas held his breath, willing himself to remain motionless. Doyle's voice came through again, barely a whisper. "They're stopping." Silas glanced towards Trapper, whose eyes met his with a silent question. "Do we engage?" He weighed their options quickly. If they attacked now, they risked alerting any other nearby patrols. But if they let these scouts get too close, "Stay ready," Silas murmured into the comms. The patrol continued to inch forward, their leader raising a hand to signal a halt. They were dangerously close to Doyle's position on the ridge now. "Do we take them?" Trapper's voice was tense but controlled. Silas hesitated for a fraction of a second longer before making his decision. "Only if they spot us," he replied quietly. Time seemed to stretch as the patrol scanned their surroundings one last time. Silas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, the patrol leader motioned for his men to move on. The tension began to ebb slightly as they resumed their path westward, oblivious to how close they had come to danger. Silas let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding and spoke into the comms again. "Regroup at my position," he instructed quietly. One by one, his team emerged from their hiding spots and made their way back to him with practiced stealth. "That was too close," Lex muttered as she rejoined the group. "Yeah," Silas agreed grimly. Silas and his team moved with a renewed sense of urgency. They loaded the last of the supplies into the jeep and checked their surroundings one final time. Satisfied that the patrol was truly gone, Silas gave the signal to mount up. Briggs took point as the jeep roared to life, its engine a low growl against the backdrop of the wasteland. Lex settled in beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. Trapper and Doyle took up positions in the back, weapons at the ready. Silas gripped the wheel, focusing on getting them back to Rustbrook without incident. The journey back was tense but uneventful. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Silas navigated the rough terrain with practiced skill, his mind already on the next steps once they reached safety. As they neared Rustbrook, Silas spotted movement along the fortified perimeter. The villagers were already on high alert, having been warned of potential danger by Miriam and the elders. The makeshift gates creaked open as they approached, and familiar faces emerged from behind cover. Miriam stood at the entrance, her stern expression softening as she saw them return safely. "You made it," she called out, relief evident in her voice. Silas brought the jeep to a halt inside the gates and killed the engine. "All clear," he said as he stepped out, helping unload the supplies. Villagers quickly gathered around, eager to assist and see what had been brought back. Burke and Jax appeared from within the crowd, their eyes widening at the sight of the cache of weapons and supplies. "You did good," Burke said, clapping Silas on the shoulder. "We all did," Silas replied, glancing at his team with a nod of acknowledgement. The atmosphere shifted from tense anticipation to cautious optimism as crates were opened and supplies distributed. The villagers' weary faces brightened with hope. Every piece of equipment meant another layer of defense against whatever threats loomed beyond their walls. Miriam approached Silas with a rare smile. "This will make a big difference," she said softly. "Glad to hear it," Silas replied, his own expression easing for a moment. As night fell over Rustbrook, fires were lit and preparations continued. The village was far from safe, but tonight they had won a small victory. Silas watched as his team integrated back into their roles within the community. Briggs helping fortify defenses, Lex discussing strategies with Miriam, Trapper sharing intel with other scouts. For now, Rustbrook stood stronger than before, its people united by purpose and determination. In the dimly lit encampment of Fraction X, the air hung heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the low murmurs of wounded soldiers. The aftermath of Silas Kane's escape left a palpable tension among the ranks. Makeshift tents lined the perimeter, each one housing those who bore the marks of the recent conflict. Lieutenant Garrett stood at the center of the camp, his face a grim mask of determination. He barked orders to medics and soldiers alike, ensuring every effort was made to heal and regroup. The camp's usual order had given way to a frenetic energy as they worked to tend to their wounded. Eric lay on a cot, his face twisted in pain as a medic cleaned and bandaged his wounds. His encounter with Silas had left him battered and seething with anger. "I should have killed him when I had the chance," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Save your strength," the medic replied without looking up. "You'll need it." Nearby, Orianthe moved through the camp with a quiet efficiency, her presence commanding respect. She stopped at Eric's side, her eyes narrowing as she took in his condition. "You underestimated him," she stated bluntly. Eric glared at her but said nothing. The truth of her words stung more than his injuries. Orianthe turned her attention to Garrett, who was coordinating efforts with an intensity that spoke volumes about his frustration. "We need to reassess our security protocols," she said as she approached him. "Silas's escape is a clear indication we have weaknesses," Garrett nodded curtly. "Agreed, but first, we need to get our people back on their feet." In one of the larger tents, several soldiers lay in various states of recovery. Conversations were hushed but filled with resolve. They spoke of Silas not with fear but with a grudging respect for his cunning and resilience. "We can't let this happen again," one soldier said, his voice barely above a whisper. Another nodded, wincing as he adjusted his bandages. "Next time, we'll be ready." Orianthe moved from cot to cot, offering words of encouragement and assessing each soldier's condition with a practiced eye. Her leadership was unwavering even in this moment of vulnerability. As night settled over the encampment, the work continued without pause. The wounded were tended to, plans were revised, and a collective resolve began to take shape among Fraction X's ranks. Silas Kane had slipped through their fingers this time, but they were determined it would not happen again.
Orianthe stayed awake after the camp quieted. Fraction X slept in shifts, like predators. Even wounded men learned to rest with one ear open. She walked the perimeter alone, boots sinking slightly into packed dust, the air smelling of antiseptic and old smoke. They built their tents fast. Efficient. Ugly. Like everything else in the wasteland. Inside the command tent, Garrett's voice had stopped hours ago. That meant one of two things. He was planning. Or he was trying not to break something. Orianthe stopped beside a supply crate and watched the horizon. Out there, beyond the black line where the wasteland swallowed light, Rustbrook sat somewhere like a rumor. And Silas Kane was breathing. That truth irritated the camp the way a splinter irritated skin, small, constant, impossible to ignore. Eric had tried to joke about it earlier. I should have killed him. He wasn't joking. Orianthe had looked at Eric's bandaged throat and felt nothing resembling sympathy. Not because she was cruel. Because she'd seen this type of man her whole life. Men who wanted violence to do their thinking for them. Men who would ruin a resource and call it strength. She heard footsteps behind her, 2 soldiers, low voices. "We'll catch him," one said. "Garrett won't stop until he does." A pause. "And when we do, I heard Marcus wants to string him up. Make an example." Orianthe turned her head slightly. The men didn't see her in the dark. The first soldier laughed softly. "Good. He embarrassed us." The second one lowered his voice. "You think he really came from White City?" Silence. "Then, doesn't matter. Here's a problem." Orianthe stepped out of the shadows. Both men jolted. Their hands moved reflexively toward weapons. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Problems, she said evenly, are solved with information. Not tantrums. The soldiers straightened. "Lieutenant." "Don't," she cut in. "Calm. Surgical." They froze. Orianthe held their gaze for a long moment, then looked past them toward the tents. "You want to kill him because it's easier than understanding him," she said. "That's what weak men do." One soldier's jaw clenched. "He escaped." "He hurt Eric." He escaped," Orianthe repeated softly. "From Fraction X." Her eyes narrowed. "Do you understand what kind of man does that?" Neither answered. Orianthe stepped closer, voice dropping. "A man like Kane doesn't survive by luck. He survives because he sees moves before they happen." She straightened. "And if he came from White City's direction, then he's carrying something we don't have." The soldiers looked uncertain now, fear leaking through confidence. Orianthe felt it too, but she didn't show it. She dismissed them with a flick of her hand. They left quickly, boots retreating into darkness. Orianthe remained on the perimeter. Wind tugged at her braid. In the far distance, faint on the horizon, White City's pale glow stained the night. She stared at it until her eyes hurt. Not because she feared the city. Because she feared what Garrett would do when he finally reached it. And what the city would do back. She turned away from the glow and walked toward Garrett's tent. There were rules in Fraction X. But rules weren't the real power. Power was what you could prevent. And tonight, Orianthe decided something quietly, decisively. If Garrett turned this into slaughter, she would stop him. Even if it meant becoming a traitor in her own camp.
In Rustbrook, the villagers gathered in the central square, a rare sight of camaraderie and celebration filling the air. Torches flickered in the twilight, casting warm glows over the rough-hewn tables laden with simple yet hearty fare. The scent of roasted meat mingled with the earthy aroma of freshly baked bread, while laughter and the clinking of tin cups echoed through the makeshift village. Silas Kane stood near one of the tables, his rugged appearance softened by the welcoming atmosphere. His eyes scanned the gathering, noting how different Rustbrook seemed in this light. Gone were the wary glances and tight-lipped suspicion. Instead, faces now wore expressions of gratitude and cautious relief. Trapper Reed approached Silas, a broad smile on his face. "Looks like we did good, Kane. Folks here are real thankful." Silas nodded, a rare smile tugging at his lips. It was a team effort. Miriam, one of the village elders, raised her cup and called for attention. The conversations died down as all eyes turned to her. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our survival but our unity," she began. We owe a great deal to Silas Kane and his team for their bravery and skill." A cheer erupted from the crowd, followed by a chorus of raised cups. Silas inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Silas," Miriam continued, gesturing for him to step forward, "would you say a few words?" He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the circle of light cast by the torches. His voice was steady as he spoke. "I'm honored to stand here among you all. What we accomplished wasn't just about supplies or defense, it was about trust and cooperation." He glanced around at the faces watching him. "Rustbrook has shown me that even in times like these, there's still hope." Another round of cheers followed his words. As the evening wore on, Silas found himself moving among the villagers more freely than he had since his arrival. Conversations flowed easily now, no longer burdened by suspicion. Briggs clapped Silas on the back as they passed by one another near the food tables. "Good to see you finally relaxing a bit," Silas chuckled. "Don't get used to it." Lex approached with a grin, holding out a cup filled with some kind of homemade brew. "To successful missions and unexpected allies," she toasted. Silas accepted the drink and clinked cups with her. "To Rustbrook," he replied. The night continued with music played on old instruments and stories shared around small fires. Silas listened intently as villagers recounted tales of their own struggles and victories. For a brief moment in time, Rustbrook felt less like a fortress against an unforgiving world and more like a beacon of resilience and community. And for Silas Kane, that was enough to make this place feel almost like home, even if just for tonight.
The fires burned lower as the night thinned. Laughter softened into smaller circles of conversation. Tin cups clinked less often. Music faded into memory. Silas stepped away from the square and walked toward the outer barricade where the torches gave way to darkness. Beyond the wooden spikes and scrap metal plating, the wasteland stretched endless and indifferent. Burke stood there already. Arms folded. Back rigid. "You move fast," Burke said without turning. Silas stopped beside him. "Didn't expect to stay." That's the problem. Wind dragged sand against the outer wall with a dry scraping sound. Fraction X didn't know this place, Burke continued. Now they will. They were expanding, Silas replied calmly. It was only a matter of time. Burke finally looked at him. Maybe. But now it's personal. Silas didn't argue. Inside the village, someone laughed loudly. The sound felt fragile out here. "You survived them," Burke said. "Men who walk out of places like that don't come alone. They bring consequences." Silas studied the dark horizon. "You want me gone. I want Rustbrook standing in a year." A pause. "And I don't know if that happens with you here." The words weren't angry. Just honest. Silas nodded once. "It will be stronger. Or it will burn." Burke stepped closer. "If this place burns, Kane. I won't forget who brought the fire." He walked back toward the square without waiting for a reply. Silas remained at the barricade. The celebration behind him. The wasteland ahead. Silas didn't sleep. He stood outside the barricade long after the fires burned low. The wasteland was quiet. Too quiet. Then, a vibration. Not sound. Not wind. A low, steady hum. He felt it first in his teeth. Then behind his eyes. He turned toward White City. The pale glow on the horizon flickered. Just once. Flat. Measured. Like something adjusting. Silas's chest tightened. The tone shifted slightly higher. Recalibrating. The same frequency. The same precision. It knows I'm here. The glow stabilized. The hum faded. Silas stood alone in the dark. Rustbrook slept. White City didn't.
In Rustbrook, the hum of activity buzzed through the village. Men and women labored at the makeshift defenses, hammering metal plates into place and reinforcing wooden barricades. Watchtowers, cobbled together from salvaged materials, rose above the perimeter, manned by vigilant guards scanning the horizon. Nearby, a group of villagers trained in combat techniques under Trapper Reed's watchful eye. The sound of wooden practice swords clashing echoed across the clearing as Trapper barked instructions. "Keep your guard up, move your feet." He corrected stances and demonstrated maneuvers with practiced ease. Further into the village, others tended to the crops, carefully nurturing what little sustenance they could coax from the barren soil. Bent over rows of vegetables, they worked methodically, their faces lined with determination and hope. Inside the central meeting hall, Silas Kane sat across from Rustbrook's elders. The room was dimly lit by lanterns, casting flickering shadows on the rough walls. Trapper stood nearby, arms crossed as he listened intently. Elder Miriam cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Silas," she began, her voice steady but grave, "we have more to discuss than just Fraction X." Silas leaned forward slightly, his expression intent. "What is it?" Miriam exchanged a glance with the other elders before continuing. "We've received reports of another force stirring in the region. They're unidentified but have been seen deploying mech patrols." Trapper's eyes narrowed. "Mechs? That's a whole new level of threat." Elder Tomas nodded. "Indeed, one of our trade posts was recently taken out by these patrols. The survivors described heavily armored units unlike anything we've seen." Silas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Do we know where they're coming from?" "Not yet," Elder Miriam admitted. "Our scouts are still gathering information. But it's clear they're organized and well-equipped." Trapper spoke up, his tone serious. "If they've got mechs, they're not just scavengers or raiders. This is something bigger." Silas considered this new information carefully. "We need to prepare for all possibilities," he said finally. "Strengthen our defenses further and train everyone to handle these new threats." The elders nodded in agreement, their faces etched with concern but also resolve. "Silas," Elder Tomas added, "we'll need your expertise more than ever now." Silas met his gaze firmly. "You have it." With that understanding established, they turned their focus to planning and strategy, knowing that Rustbrook's survival depended on their collective strength and vigilance in the face of growing dangers both known and unknown. Silas stood, nodding to the elders. "All right, let's get to work. We need to reinforce our defenses, train our people, and put small recon teams out there. We do what we can with what we have." Trapper moved to a large map pinned to the wall, pointing at various locations around Rustbrook. "We've identified several key points that need immediate fortification. We'll start here." He indicated a vulnerable section near the southern perimeter. Elder Miriam added, "And don't forget the northern approach. It's less fortified but equally critical." Silas turned to the gathered villagers. "Everyone who can wield a weapon or help with building defenses needs to be involved. Training starts immediately." Trapper nodded in agreement. "I'll lead the training sessions and organize patrols."
Training looked clean from a distance. From far away, it was lines. Discipline. People moving with purpose. Up close, it was bruises. It was fear disguised as instruction. Silas crossed the clearing where Trapper had been drilling villagers since dawn. The sun was already high, heat pressing down like a hand. A ring of onlookers stood around the sparring yard, men and women gripping scrap blades and patched rifles like they were trying to convince themselves those objects meant safety. Trapper barked an order. Again. Two trainees collided, clumsy. One slipped in the dirt. The other swung too wide. And the scrap blade caught flesh. A sharp sound. A gasp. Blood spilled onto dust. The clearing went silent. The injured woman dropped to her knees, clutching her forearm, eyes wide like she couldn't understand how quickly training turned into harm. Someone rushed forward. Someone swore. Silas stepped in before panic could become a stampede. "Hold," he said, voice controlled. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. People froze. He crouched beside the woman and inspected the wound. Not deep, but messy. Dirty metal. Infection could kill faster than bullets out here. Get clean water, he said, not asking. Now. A teenager sprinted toward the well. Trapper moved closer, jaw tight. My fault. Silas looked up at him. No. It's the cost. Trapper's eyes hardened. They're not ready. They won't ever be ready, Silas said quietly. They'll just be less unready. The woman's breathing trembled. Silas took a strip of cloth, pressed it to the cut, and held it firm. Listen to me, he said to her, calm and direct. You're not dying here. But you're going to respect steel from now on. Her eyes flicked to him. And in that look Silas saw the truth of Rustbrook. These people weren't soldiers. They were survivors trying to become soldiers because the world had forced them. Silas stood and turned to the gathered trainees. You want to live? He asked, voice steady. No one answered. You want Rustbrook to stand? He pressed. A few nodded. Then stop pretending training is safe, Silas said. There's no safe version of what's coming. He pointed toward the perimeter. Fraction X doesn't care if your hands shake, he said. Mex won't care if you're afraid. He let that sit. Then, softer, but you can still learn to move anyway. Trapper exhaled, anger and respect mixing in his posture. Silas looked at him. Double the med supplies on patrols. Blade stay dulled unless I say otherwise. Trapper nodded. Understood. Silas watched the trainees regroup. Some looked terrified. Some looked angry. A few looked determined. Good. Determination was the only thing you could build out here that didn't rust. As Silas walked away, he heard Burke's voice from the edge of the clearing. Low. Bitter. This is what he brought. Silas didn't turn. Because Burke was right. And because the truth didn't care who spoke it. The cut didn't look like much. By morning, it looked worse. The woman from training, Mara, sat on a stool outside the infirmary hut, arm wrapped tight in cloth that had already soaked through. Silas stood in front of her. The skin around the wound was swollen. Angry red. Spreading. You cleaned it? He asked. Trapper nodded. Boiled water. Herbs from Ilara's trade. Did everything right. Mara's breathing was shallow. It burns, she whispered. Silas crouched. He knew that tone. Not pain. Poison. You pushed them too fast, Burke said from behind him. Silas didn't turn. Steel shouldn't touch skin that early. We don't have time, Silas replied. Burke stepped closer. Then we bury them faster. Silence. The infection line crawled up Mara's forearm like something alive. Silas stood slowly. Cut it, he said. Trapper froze. Silas? Now. Mara's eyes widened. Better an arm than a grave, Silas said, voice steady. Burke stared at him. Your training, Burke said quietly, cost her that. Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because Burke was right.
As they continued planning, Silas turned back to Elder Miriam. You mentioned a trading post being attacked. Do you know their locations? Miriam pointed to a spot on the map several miles from Rustbrook. Here and here. These posts are vital for our trade routes and supplies. Silas considered the distances and terrain. We need to send a team to warn them and recruit any able-bodied men they have. We need more manpower and materials. Trapper stepped forward again, his expression determined. I'll take a team out there myself. Silas placed a hand on Trapper's shoulder, appreciating his readiness. Good. Take whoever you need and move quickly but cautiously. We can't afford any more surprises. Miriam nodded in agreement, her eyes reflecting both worry and hope. We'll do our part here, Silas. Rustbrook will be ready. As the meeting concluded, Silas and Trapper began assembling their teams, each member understanding the urgency of their mission. The village buzzed with activity as everyone prepared for what lay ahead. Silas addressed his team one final time before they set off for the trading posts. Stay alert and stick together. We bring back anyone willing to fight or help us build up our defenses. Trapper checked his gear, then turned to Silas with a resolute nod. Let's move out. With that, they headed into the wasteland towards the trading posts, knowing that every moment counted in their fight for survival and preparation against whatever threats lay ahead. In Rustbrook, villagers worked tirelessly under Elder Miriam's guidance, reinforcing barricades and sharpening their combat skills under Trapper's direction when he wasn't on mission. The combined efforts of training within Rustbrook and outreach missions aimed at strengthening alliances marked a pivotal moment in their struggle for survival against mounting threats. Silas led his team through the rugged terrain toward the trading posts. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the wasteland. Among his group were seasoned traders and former scavengers, their faces etched with experience and determination. As they approached the first trading post, a small settlement surrounded by makeshift defenses, Silas signaled his team to stay alert but relaxed. They entered the post, where wary eyes tracked their every move. After noon, Silas greeted the traders, displaying an open palm to show he meant no harm. We're from Rustbrook, looking to trade and share some important news. The head trader, a burly man with a grizzled beard named Bartok, stepped forward. Rustbrook, what brings you out here? Need supplies and have some information to share, Silas replied. Might be in your interest to hear us out. Bartok eyed him cautiously but nodded. All right, let's see what you got. Silas motioned to Trapper and the others, who began unloading various goods they had brought for trade, ammunition, tools, and foodstuffs. As they haggled and exchanged items, the atmosphere grew more cordial. One of the traders, a lean woman named Alara, handed Silas a small bag of dried herbs. Good for pain relief, she said with a smile. Silas nodded his thanks. Appreciate it. Now, about that information, Bartok crossed his arms. Go on. Silas took a deep breath. Fraction X is on the move. They've been hitting settlements and trading posts like yours. Murmurs of concern spread through the traders. We barely made it out alive, Trapper added. Rustbrook's fortifying its defenses, and we need all the help we can get, Alara frowned. And what do you propose? Silas leaned in slightly. Join us in Rustbrook. We can defend each other better together than apart. Bartok scratched his beard thoughtfully. Strength in numbers, huh? What's Rustbrook got that we don't? A solid plan, Silas said firmly. Training for combat, fortified defenses, and experienced fighters willing to stand against Fraction X. The traders exchanged glances before Bartok spoke again. We'll need some convincing. Come see for yourselves, Trapper suggested. Bring your best men and take a look at what we've built. Alara nodded slowly. If it's as good as you say, we might consider it. Bartok extended his hand to Silas. All right then, we'll send a few of our folks to check it out. Silas shook Bartok's hand firmly. You won't regret it. With their trade completed, they moved on to the next post. Each stop followed a similar pattern, swift exchanges and cautious glances. Silas ensured their presence was brief yet efficient, knowing time was a luxury they couldn't afford. By midday, they reached the final trading post. This one was larger, more fortified. Silas felt a pang of unease but pushed it aside as they approached. We need supplies, he stated, laying out their offerings. The head trader scrutinized them before agreeing to the exchange. As they loaded up on necessities, Silas's senses remained on high alert. Briggs noticed too and exchanged a meaningful look with him. Almost done here, Briggs murmured. Stay sharp, Silas replied. With the last of their trades completed, the team began their journey back to Rustbrook. The jeep hummed steadily beneath them as they navigated through the winding paths and open stretches of land. When Rustbrook came into view, relief washed over Silas briefly, until he saw Miriam waiting at the gates with a grim expression. What's wrong? He asked as soon as they stepped out of the vehicle. We've been scouted, Miriam said tersely. Mechs, no attack yet, but they were close. Silas clenched his jaw. Everyone okay? For now, Miriam replied. We need to be ready. Silas nodded and turned to his team. Unload and prepare. We need everyone on high alert. Trapper moved quickly to help unload while Lex disappeared into the village to spread the word. Briggs stood guard at the gate alongside Doyle. Silas walked up to Miriam and met her gaze squarely. "We'll fortify our defenses." Miriam nodded slowly, determination hardening her features. "We must." As Silas watched his team work seamlessly together, a fierce resolve settled within him. They would protect Rustbrook, whatever it took. Silas leaned against the central meeting table, listening as the newcomers outlined their observations. Bartok, the head trader, pointed to a rough map of the region spread out before them. His finger tapped insistently on a mark labeled, Old Prus Lookout. "It's abandoned, but still stands," Bartok said. "We used to avoid it, thinking it'd be swarming with raiders or worse. But if you can secure it, it's a perfect vantage point." Trapper nodded, a faint smile tugging at his scruffy beard. "I know that place. High ground, good sightlines. We could spot any approaching threats miles off." Silas narrowed his eyes, tracing the line from Rustbrook to the Old Prus Lookout with his gaze. "Are we sure it's abandoned?" he asked, skepticism edging his voice. "I've heard some of the old officers might still be holed up there." Bartok shrugged, the movement barely noticeable under his thick coat. "It's possible. We've seen no signs of activity, but then again, we've kept our distance. If those officers are still there," Trapper interjected, "recruiting them could give us a serious advantage. They know the terrain, have combat experience. We could use that." Miriam leaned forward, her silver hair catching the dim light. "It's worth investigating," she said. "But we need to approach carefully. If they're hostile or allied with Fraction X, it could backfire." Silas nodded in agreement. "We'll send a small team. Quiet and fast. If they're friendly, we negotiate. If not, we get out before they can alert anyone." Trapper smirked. "I know just the folks for this kind of job. Who do you have in mind?" Miriam asked. "Briggs and Lex," Trapper replied without hesitation. "They're our best scouts. Silent as shadows and quick thinkers." Miriam gave a curt nod. "Agreed. But Silas, I want you to lead them. Your experience with the White City and Fraction X makes you the best candidate." Silas didn't argue. He simply nodded and began planning the approach in his mind. Bartok added, "If you manage to recruit those officers, we might have a chance to turn the tide against Fraction X's advances." Trapper slapped Silas on the shoulder with a grin that softened his usually gruff demeanor. "Guess we're going hunting again." Silas smirked back, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Let's hope it's a friendly hunt this time." They broke from their huddle, each moving with purpose towards their tasks. Bartok coordinating supplies, Miriam overseeing fortifications, and Trapper rounding up Briggs and Lex. The sense of urgency was palpable as Silas prepared for another trek into uncertainty. But this time, there was a flicker of hope that allies might be found rather than enemies. As Silas strapped on his gear and checked his weapons, he glanced back at Trapper one last time before heading out. "Ready, always?" Trapper's response was steady as they stepped into the cool evening air together. The path ahead was fraught with risks but potentially rich with rewards. A chance to bolster Rustbrook's defenses with experienced fighters if fortune favored them. Elder Miriam glanced between Silas and Trapper. "It's risky, but necessary. We need eyes on every possible approach." Another trader, a wiry woman named Marla, stepped forward. "There's more we can do than just lookouts. We've got contacts, engineers who could help us build weapons and ammo. Maybe even reverse engineer some of the tech we've scavenged." Silas's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Engineers could turn the tide. More firepower means we stand a better chance against Fraction X's mechs." Bartok leaned in closer to the map, his voice low but firm. "We'll need to act fast. Get those engineers here and set up production before they strike again." Miriam nodded slowly. "I'll send messengers to your contacts immediately. And we'll need volunteers to scout and secure that lookout." Miriam turned to Marla and Bartok. "You two start drafting plans for the new defenses and weapons production with our current resources." The traders exchanged glances and nodded in agreement. Silas pushed off the table and moved towards the door, his mind already on the next steps. "We leave at first light." Silas and his team, Trapper, Lex, and Briggs, set out from Rustbrook at dawn, joined by 2 guards, Carter and Nash. They moved on foot, careful and silent. The desert stretched before them, a barren expanse dotted with scraggly brush and rocky outcrops. "Carter, you're on point," Silas ordered in a low voice. "Nash, you take recon. Trapper, Lex, cover the flanks." The group fell into their roles seamlessly. Carter led the way with sharp eyes scanning for threats. Nash moved ahead and to the side, slipping through shadows like a wraith. Trapper took the right flank, his steps light despite his weather-beaten frame. Lex covered the left with silent precision, her knife belt secured and ready. Hours passed as they carefully made their way through the unforgiving landscape. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth beneath their feet. The team remained vigilant, every step calculated to avoid detection. A sudden motion in the distance made Silas raise his hand to halt. They dropped to the ground as a small raider party appeared over a dune, rough figures armed with makeshift weapons. "Stay low," Silas whispered. The raiders moved closer but seemed unaware of the hidden team. Holding their breath, they waited until the group passed before continuing their journey. Just as they thought the path was clear, a strange shape appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a vehicle, it looked like a robot. "Mech," Trapper hissed under his breath. The machine's sensors whirred as it noticed them. Without warning, it attacked. "Spread out," Silas shouted. Laser fire cut through the air as the mech advanced. Silas dove for cover behind a boulder, returning fire with precision shots aimed at weak points in its armor. Briggs and Lex flanked it, taking shots at its joints to slow it down. Carter and Nash provided suppressing fire from behind cover. The mech's weapons were fierce, energy bolts exploded around them. Carter took a direct hit to the chest and fell without a sound. Nash tried to drag him back but was struck down by another blast. "We've got to disable it," Trapper yelled over the chaos. Silas nodded grimly and aimed for its power core. His shot hit home, causing sparks to fly from its chest plate. The mech staggered but continued its assault. Briggs took another shot at its leg joint while Lex went for an exposed wire near its shoulder. The combined effort caused it to stumble and finally collapse in a heap of metal. Breathing heavily, Silas approached cautiously with Trapper by his side. They scavenged parts from the disabled mech.
The mech lay twisted in the dunes. Metal ticking. Sand still hissing where energy bolts had burned it black. Silas moved first to Carter. The armor had fused into his chest plate. The blast had been clean. Instant. No blood. Just heat. Nash lay several paces away, eyes open to the sky. Silas knelt and closed them. No speeches. No ceremony. Only wind. Lex stood over the machine's wreckage, staring. "That wasn't random," she said quietly. Silas looked at her. "It scanned us first," she continued. Adjusted its firing pattern. Briggs wiped grit from his face. "That wasn't scavenged tech." Trapper crouched beside the exposed torso, peeling back cracked plating. "Factory assembly," he muttered. "Precision joints. Reinforced actuator lines." Silas stepped closer to the shattered core housing. The shot he had taken wasn't luck. He had aimed for a seam. But after first impact, the mech had shifted its armor distribution. Adapted. He felt it settle in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. "This wasn't wasteland chaos," Silas said quietly. Trapper glanced up. This was deployed. Wind rolled across the dunes, covering Carter's boots with sand. Lex swallowed. "If they're sending one, they'll send more," Silas finished. He stood slowly. "Strip what we can. We bury them at the lookout." Briggs nodded once. No one argued. As they worked, the desert felt different. Not empty. Observed. And somewhere beyond the horizon, someone had just learned how they fought.
Silas led the remaining group, Trapper, Lex, and Briggs, forward. The loss of Carter and Nash weighed heavily on their minds, but there was no time to mourn. The sun blazed overhead, relentless and searing. Trapper moved steadily beside Silas, his experienced eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Lex kept her focus on their surroundings, every muscle tense and ready. Briggs followed close behind, his rifle cradled in his arms as if it were an extension of himself. They trudged through the sand, each step sinking slightly into the hot grains. The air shimmered with heat waves, distorting the landscape and making it difficult to discern shapes in the distance. Their water supplies dwindled rapidly, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that turning back was not an option. Hours dragged by in a haze of sweat and determination. The desert seemed endless, a barren wasteland that offered no respite. Yet they kept moving, pushing through the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm them. At last, after what felt like an eternity, they saw it, the faint outlines of the lookout point emerging from the wavering heat. Relief surged through them, giving their tired bodies a much-needed burst of energy. "There it is," Silas said, pointing ahead. "We're almost there." They quickened their pace despite their fatigue. As they approached the outpost, its features became clearer. A structure built for defense with high walls and watchtowers standing sentinel against the harsh desert. Silas signaled for everyone to be on high alert. They didn't know what to expect or what might be waiting for them within those walls. "Stay sharp," Trapper muttered, echoing Silas's thoughts. Lex tightened her grip on her knife belt. The team scanned the outpost, their eyes sharp against the darkening landscape. Silas peered through his binoculars, assessing every shadow and angle. There was no trace of raiders or scavengers, but they remained vigilant. The desert could hide many threats, and complacency would only invite disaster. "Looks clear," Lex whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Still, keep your guard up," Silas replied, lowering his binoculars. Trapper moved closer to the outpost, using the cover of the team. He advanced slowly, every step calculated. Night had fallen, casting long shadows across the sand and cloaking the outpost in darkness. The air cooled slightly, offering a reprieve from the day's relentless heat. As Trapper moved closer, lights suddenly flared to life around the outpost, casting harsh beams that cut through the night. The team's instincts kicked in immediately. They crouched low and drew their weapons, ready for anything. A voice boomed from a speaker mounted on one of the towers. "This is an official National Outpost Guard. No entry is allowed. Turn back immediately." Trapper froze, recognizing the voice that carried a mix of authority and weariness. He stepped forward cautiously and called out, "Elmet, is that you?" There was a moment of tense silence before the speaker crackled again. "Trapper, is it really you?" "It's me," Trapper confirmed, relief evident in his tone. "Hold your position," Elmet ordered. "I'll come down." The lights remained trained on them as they waited, but there was a palpable shift in tension. Silas and the rest of the team exchanged glances, relaxing slightly but keeping their guard up. A figure emerged from the main gate and approached with measured steps. As Elmet drew closer, Trapper's face broke into a rare smile. "It's been a long time," Trapper said. Elmet nodded, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Too long. What brings you here?" Trapper clapped Elmet on the shoulder. "We've got trouble, old friend. Fraction X is making moves, and they're not shy about using force. This is Silas," he said, motioning to the man beside him. "He's the one who got us here in one piece." Elmet nodded at Silas, his eyes scanning over the rest of the team. "And the rest?" "Briggs, Lex, and Doyle," Trapper introduced each in turn. "They're solid." Elmet's gaze lingered on each member of the team, assessing them with a practiced eye. "Good to meet you all. Now, what's this about Fraction X?" Silas stepped forward, his voice steady. "They're expanding their territory and hitting settlements hard. Rustbrook's in their sights," Elmet frowned. "Rustbrook? That little village beyond the cracked hills?" "That's the one," Trapper confirmed. "We've been working on fortifying it, but we need more hands and supplies." Elmet crossed his arms, considering the situation. "And you came here for?" We need allies, Silas said plainly. Rustbrook's defenses are being bolstered, but without support, we won't hold out long if Fraction X comes in full force. We started reinforcing key points around Rustbrook, Trapper added. Training villagers in combat, setting up patrols. But we can't do it alone. Elmet looked at them for a long moment before nodding slowly. You know I'll help where I can, but resources are tight here too. Silas inclined his head in acknowledgement. We understand. Any support you can offer, men, supplies, would make a difference. We'll need to move quickly, Trapper added. Fraction X won't wait for us to get comfortable. Elmet uncrossed his arms and sighed. Alright then, let's discuss specifics inside. He motioned for them to follow him. As they walked through the gate and into the outpost, Elmet led them to a small command center filled with maps and radio equipment. He pointed to a map pinned on the wall showing Rustbrook's location. Show me what you've got planned so far, Elmet said. Trapper stepped up and began explaining their strategy for fortifying Rustbrook, pointing out weak spots that needed shoring up and areas where patrols would be most effective. We've also identified nearby trading posts that can provide additional manpower and supplies, Silas added. Elmet listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking questions for clarification. After several minutes of detailed discussion, Elmet leaned back against a table, arms crossed again but with a look of resolve on his face. All right, I'll see what we can spare. Elmet nodded as the plans came together. We'll send a few of our officers back with you to Rustbrook. They'll help with training and fortifying defenses. In return, some of your villagers can stay here to learn from our setup and assist with our own needs. Silas exchanged a look with Trapper, both men nodding in agreement. Sounds fair, Silas said. Elmet gestured towards a nearby officer. This is Lieutenant Hawk. He'll lead the team heading to Rustbrook. Hawk stepped forward, his sharp eyes studying Silas and the others. I've got a squad ready to move out at first light. Good, Silas replied. We appreciate the support. Hawk's gaze shifted to the remains of the mech they had brought with them. Is that what took down Carter and Nash? Silas followed his gaze. We've been hearing rumors about these mechs, but seeing one up close, it's something else. Hawk crouched down, examining the mechanical parts with interest. If we can figure out how it works, we might be able to use it against them. Trapper joined them, nodding in agreement. That's what we were thinking too. Any insights you have would be invaluable. Elmet turned back to Silas and Trapper. We'll have our engineers take a closer look at this mech while you're here. Maybe we can learn something useful before sending it back with you. Silas agreed, feeling a glimmer of hope that this collaboration might turn the tide in their favor. Every bit helps, he said. Elmet stood up straight and clapped his hands together. All right then, let's get moving. Hawk, gather your squad and make sure they're ready by dawn. Hawk saluted and left to prepare his team. Elmet turned back to Silas and Trapper, his expression serious but determined. We'll do everything we can to support Rustbrook. And in return, we'll need your help fortifying our defenses here too. Silas extended his hand towards Elmet, sealing their agreement with a firm shake.
The hangar lights hummed softly over the damaged mech chassis. Orianthe stood alone beside it. Garrett lingered near the entrance, arms folded. Orianthe ignored him. The memory core had been partially recovered. Enough to replay engagement telemetry. She activated the projection. Grainy footage flickered to life. The mech advanced. Targets identified. Then, a single hostile moved differently. Precise. Efficient. He aimed for structural weakness, not center mass. The second shot came after the mech adjusted its plating. He had noticed. He knew where to hit, Orianthe said quietly. Garrett scoffed. Lucky shot. No. She replayed the frame. Power core seemed compromised at reinforced joint. Not obvious. Not accidental. Garrett shifted. You're overthinking a drifter? Orianthe didn't blink. Above the projection display, faint network lines pulsed, routing signals outward. White city relay markers. Garrett didn't look up. Orianthe did. She studied the freeze frame of Silas Kane one last time. He didn't fight like a scavenger. He fought like someone who understood systems. Garrett turned toward the exit. He won't survive the next one. Orianthe shut down the projection. Maybe, she said. But for the first time since he escaped. She wasn't sure who was hunting who.
Rustbrook buzzed with renewed energy. The arrival of new people from the Outpost, including Lieutenant Hawk and his team, brought fresh knowledge and strategies. Villagers trained harder, now bolstered by Hawk's tactical drills. Silas watched as a young man practiced a takedown maneuver, noting the precision in his movements. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the surrounding fields, a rare moment of serenity in the wasteland. But the peace felt fragile, as if balanced on a knife's edge. Then, as if nature sensed the impending danger, the sky darkened abruptly. Ominous clouds rolled in, casting long shadows over Rustbrook. A chill ran down Silas's spine. He looked up, frowning at the sudden shift. The alarm sounded, a piercing wail that sent everyone into action. "Fraction X," someone shouted. Silas sprinted to the gate, his heart pounding with adrenaline. "Positions," he barked. Trapper Reed nodded, already coordinating villagers to man the defenses. The enemy swarmed over the hill like a dark tide. Chaos erupted. Villagers fired from makeshift barricades while others wielded spears and knives against the onslaught. Silas fought beside Trapper and Briggs, their movements synchronized from countless drills. Amidst the clamor of battle, Silas spotted a familiar figure, Orianthe, leading Fraction X's charge with cold precision. She cut through Rustbrook's defenders like a whirlwind of steel. "Hold your ground," Silas roared over the din. Briggs tackled an enemy to the ground while Lex covered him with swift shots from her crossbow. Trapper took down another with his axe, but more surged forward. Orianthe pushed deeper into Rustbrook, her eyes locking with Silas's for a fleeting moment. He read determination in her gaze but also something else, a flicker of hesitation. Silas and Orianthe clashed in the center of the village. Sparks flew as their weapons met in brutal harmony. He could see her assessing him even in combat, weighing her options. A sudden burst of gunfire from Briggs distracted Orianthe long enough for Silas to disarm her. He pressed his blade to her throat but hesitated. "Yield," he commanded. She glared at him but dropped her weapon. Villagers quickly restrained her while Silas scanned the battlefield. The tide had turned. Fraction X was retreating under relentless fire and fierce resistance. As calm returned to Rustbrook, Silas approached Orianthe, who sat bound but unbroken. "Why are you here?" he asked. "You know why," she replied, her voice steady despite her defeat. Silas crouched before her. "You're too smart for this chaos. Join us instead." Orianthe narrowed her eyes but remained silent, considering his words carefully amidst the rubble and aftermath of battle. Orianthe's silence stretched, broken only by the distant cries of wounded villagers and the crackle of burning debris. Silas watched her, searching for any sign that she might consider his offer. Around them, the village bustled with activity as survivors tended to the injured and fortified their defenses. "Silas," Trapper called out, approaching with urgency in his step. "We've secured the perimeter. What do we do with her?" Silas glanced at Orianthe, then back at Trapper. "We keep her under close guard. She's valuable." Trapper nodded, signaling two villagers to take Orianthe away. As they led her to a secure cabin, she cast one last glance over her shoulder at Silas, eyes narrowing in thought. Turning back to the scene, Silas felt a mix of exhaustion and relief wash over him. The village had survived another assault, but each attack left them more worn down. He knew they needed more than just brute strength to hold out against Fraction X. "Silas," Elder Miriam's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood nearby, her face lined with worry and determination. "We need to talk." They moved to a quieter spot near the central structure. Miriam gestured for Silas to sit on a bench beside her. "The villagers fought bravely today," she began, "but it's clear we're stretched thin." Silas nodded. We need more allies and better strategies. Miriam sighed, looking out at the bustling village. We can't keep relying on just defense. We need to take the fight to them. Silas's mind raced through possibilities. There's still that mech we disabled and brought back here, he said thoughtfully. If we could reverse engineer it, Miriam raised an eyebrow. That's risky, but necessary, Silas countered. It might give us an edge. Miriam leaned back, considering his words. I'll gather our engineers and see what they can do with it. As she rose to leave, Trapper approached again, this time with a grim expression. Silas, there's something you need to see. They followed Trapper through the village until they reached the edge of Rustbrook, where a small group of villagers had gathered around something on the ground. What is it? Silas asked. Trapper pointed down at a piece of tattered fabric emblazoned with Fraction X's emblem. We found this near one of the bodies. Silas knelt down, inspecting the fabric closely. It wasn't just any emblem, it was marked with symbols indicating rank and status within Fraction X. This belonged to someone important, Silas murmured. Trapper nodded grimly. Which means they'll be back, and in greater numbers. Silas stood up, clutching the fabric tightly in his hand as he looked out over Rustbrook once more. The village was safe for now, but he knew their fight was far from over. We need to be ready, he said quietly but firmly. Miriam joined them, her eyes reflecting the same resolve. We will be. The village buzzed with a nervous energy as Silas and Miriam made their way to the makeshift workshop where the engineers had started dismantling the captured mech. The interior was filled with the clanging of metal and the hiss of welding torches, a stark contrast to the tense silence outside. We're making progress, one of the engineers reported, looking up from his workbench covered in scattered parts. But it's going to take time to understand this tech. Silas studied the disassembled pieces, trying to decipher their functions. Time isn't something we have much of. Another engineer wiped sweat from his brow. We'll do what we can, but integrating this into our defenses is a challenge. Miriam placed a reassuring hand on Silas's shoulder. They're doing their best. Silas nodded, though his mind raced with plans and contingencies. We need to expedite this process. I'll talk to Bartok. See if he can spare some of his tech-savvy people. Leaving the workshop, they walked back through Rustbrook's narrow streets. Villagers paused their work to nod respectfully at them, a mix of hope and worry etched on their faces. As they neared the central square, Silas noticed Orianthe standing under guard near the secure cabin. Her gaze was fixed on him, intense and calculating. Let me talk to her, Silas told Miriam. Miriam hesitated but then signaled the guards to step back slightly. Silas approached Orianthe, keeping his voice low. Why are you here? He asked directly. Orianthe met his gaze evenly. You know why. Silas crossed his arms. We need information about Fraction X's next move. She glanced around at the villagers bustling nearby before speaking again. I might have some intel, but it comes at a price. Silas arched an eyebrow. What price? My freedom, she replied without hesitation. Silas studied her for a moment, weighing her words carefully. Trusting Orianthe was risky, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I can't promise that, he said finally. But if your information is good, we can negotiate. Orianthe nodded slightly. Fraction X is planning an assault on Rustbrook soon, within days. They're amassing forces just beyond the eastern ridge. Silas felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat of the day. If she was telling the truth, they had even less time than he thought. Why are you helping us? He asked quietly. Orianthe's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Because there's more at stake here than just your village or Fraction X. Before Silas could press further, Trapper approached with urgent news. Silas, we've spotted scouts near the eastern perimeter, Trapper said breathlessly. Silas turned to Miriam, who had joined them upon hearing Trapper's words. We need everyone ready, Silas instructed quickly. And prepare for evacuation if necessary. Miriam nodded sharply and began issuing orders to nearby villagers. As chaos erupted around them, Silas locked eyes with Orianthe once more. For now, she remained an enigma, one that could tip the balance in their favor or lead them to ruin.